This episode is made possible by Ren.
I will never understand people.
They're the worst.
Oftentimes, when you talk about socialism with someone, you get to this point in the conversation. Socialism sounds good in theory, but it could never work in real life. People are too competitive, too greedy, too selfish, too cruel, too violent. To insert something bad. They're the worst. Or sometimes, the conversation doesn't focus on how evil people are, but on how commerce-driven humans are. Socialism would never work because humans are economic animals with brains built for trade and maximizing our returns on investment. Much of the public debate about socialism doesn't really focus on the merits of socialism. Instead of debating whether it would be better if everyone was housed, fed, free from exploitation, and working shorter days, because it's immediately obvious that it would be, or how we might get there and the institutions that would coordinate these needs, the conversation gets cut short on the grounds that it's unrealistic. Despite socialists proving the possibility of these things empirically, through experimentation, logic, and historical or cross-cultural parallel, all these efforts are struck down by these really simple statements that just kind of sound true. Sure, capitalism sucks, but that's because humans suck, so why should we believe socialism could be any better? Socialism is pie in the sky. It's hubris from young people who don't know how the world works yet. Just wait till you hit your 30s and you'll grow out of it. And I understand why this works. It's a convincing idea. Everyone has people in their life who are greedy, selfish jerks, and everyone can recognize the part of themselves that is a greedy, selfish jerk. It stands to reason that human nature has, at the very least, an element of selfishness and cruelty to it. But this has very little to do with socialism, and as a justification for capitalism, it's a very strange one. In this video, I'm not going to prove what human nature is or isn't. If you'd like to watch a video approaching this question from a biological perspective, go check out my buddy Yugopnik's video from a couple months ago, where he breaks down the nature versus nurture debate using twin studies and emerging science on epigenetics. Don't like that? Check out Andrewism's video about how different philosophical traditions have interpreted the human nature argument across time and space, and the kinds of society that flourished with different understandings of humanity. Two great videos, two very different approaches, two pretty similar conclusions. Human nature is not a very good argument. In this video, I'm going to take a third approach to this conclusion. We're going to be looking at how this idea of a singular, corrupt, logical, and self-interested human nature gains traction as a defense of capitalism, the inherent contradictions of this idea, and why it doesn't actually undermine socialist politics. And I know I'm fighting a stupid battle here. The human nature argument is one that takes like 3 seconds to make, and that anti-socialists never feel like they have to justify. Except maybe by pointing to someone doing something bad and calling it proof, or relying on the assumption that if a past socialist experiment failed, it was because of human nature. Debunking this is going to take me many minutes because I'm not going to take those easy shortcuts, and maybe that makes what I'm doing even dumber. Anyway, the first thing to address with a lot of these human nature claims is how weirdly essentializing they are. For some reason, when human nature is invoked, it's always the part of human nature that sucks that we focus on, despite the fact that we have millions of examples of people being selfless. People regularly make massive personal sacrifices before their brain even has the time to compute what kind of selfish benefit they might gain from it. There are plenty of documented cases of people jumping into a river to save a drowning stranger at the drop of a hat, and probably even more undocumented cases of the same thing. Hundreds of millions of hours are volunteered every year. Mutual aid networks exist throughout the world. And on a daily basis, you almost certainly do something kind for someone else. Tiny little selfless acts like opening a door for someone are almost invisible in our everyday life because they're so immediate and common. I'll admit these aren't the strongest arguments I've ever made on this channel, but the reason I'm not spending too much time on them is because, 1, as I'll flesh out later in the video, socialism doesn't require selflessness by any means. A socialist world could work even if it was filled with people who are fundamentally, ontologically greedy. And 2, before we even get to that, I have to point out that there's no reason to think people are more fundamentally greedy than they are generous. And even if we are more fundamentally greedy, the simple fact that selfishness and greed exist is not a justification for building an economic system that rewards that behavior. If you believe that humans are naturally selfish, rather than believing that it's something we're capable of and that we're equally capable of kindness, and most of the time we just flip-flop between the two, that's fine. I probably won't be able to convince you otherwise. But I won't spend too much time on that because no matter what you believe human nature is, it doesn't logically follow that selfishness and greed should be the ticket to wealth and power in our society. If you think we're all rotten to our core, you're going to need another piece of evidence or some other argument to prove to me that that means our society should reward those who take this to the extreme. That the most openly selfish and greedy of us deserve to be on top. My guess is those arguments aren't going to be very convincing. I don't know many people that believe society would be best served when selfish people are in charge and have more power to be selfish. But not all arguments about human nature as a justification for capitalism take this form. Instead of arguing for capitalism from the point of greed and selfishness, both of which have a negative connotation, some people claim that we are built for the profit-seeking trade that capitalism depends on, and that capitalism actually evolved out of this aspect of human nature. In The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, one of the first and most influential defenders of capitalism, wrote that there is, quote, a certain propensity in human nature. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Unlike animals, Smith says that humans are simply designed to exchange and compare and seek out the best deal. As a counterexample, Smith says, quote, nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. But we people, we're human because we are driven towards profit by trade, and therefore capitalism is just the inevitable social system that results from individual behaviors. The problem is that Smith just made this up. He made it up. He's not wrong that humans trade and that for the most part, animals don't. But all Smith did was see that people around him were trading goods for other goods or for currency. He saw that other animals weren't doing it, and so he essentialized it as part of human nature basically on a whim. He assumed that this must be something humans are hardwired to do, and that we must have always done. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith imagines, which is to say he guesses, that the history of humanity is one where we start trading small goods with one another, I'll give you this thing for that thing, then we figure out that this is inefficient as we specialize in our labor, and therefore we start creating currencies. First we use salt and leather to trade goods, and eventually we figure out precious metals work best because they travel well and you can standardize them. And eventually, quite naturally, you get a market system based on maximizing the amount of precious metals you have. This then becomes more complex and larger until you develop systems of debt and accounting. And soon enough, you have capitalism. If you've ever taken an Econ 101 class, there's a good chance you've heard this story before. Capitalism, for Smith, happens very naturally, and it all starts from the fact that this is just how humans work and interact with one another. It's a really effective justification for capitalism, because if maximizing profit through trade is just what humans do, and it transcends time and space, then every outcome of trade is justified. Why would we ever question it or get in its way? Morality is always changing, it's different from person to person, and nobody can agree on it. But profit-seeking is immortal, and it's part of us, so it becomes untouchable. But like I said, this was just Adam Smith's best guess. When you go looking through history and throughout the world, as David Graeber does in Debt the First 5,000 Years, this story of truck and barter becoming currency, becoming capitalism, just doesn't exist anywhere. The ethnologist Caroline Humphrey puts it really bluntly. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money. All available ethnography suggests that there has never been such a thing. Most of human existence until very recently was spent just giving other people stuff. Different societies in different parts of the world did things differently. Some would have central collection points where resources would be gathered and then redistributed. In other places, people privileged gift giving as a means of exchange. And almost everywhere, people just gave each other things and services either for nothing in return or the vague idea that the other person owed them one. Adam Smith's idea that people were out there figuring out how many bones were worth one really good stick and this eventually turning into capitalism is just not something we've ever been able to find historical proof of. What we do have plenty of proof of is that for most of human existence, we ran our economies on gifts and the common ownership of resources. Barter existed, but at most it was a very small part of human life, and one that you were pretty unlikely to ever encounter at any point in human history. The historical record doesn't seem to show that it's in our human nature to truck and barter, at least a lot less than it indicates that it's in our nature to work together and make collective decisions. And look, I'm not saying that we should limit our imagination for what society should look like based on what we think human nature is, or what we're able to find in pre-existing social models. I'm just saying that if your justification for capitalism is that it's more respectful of our propensity to barter, The historical record shows we are way more capable of doing things differently. Even if someday we find out that Adam Smith had a lucky guess and we did indeed spend most of history getting really good at trading stuff, that wouldn't make capitalism more justifiable because capitalism isn't just about trade. Capitalism is an economic system where a few people own all the tools we need to make stuff. The factories, the farms, the machinery. In other words, the means of production. And use this privileged ownership to employ the vast majority of people to work and transform it into something productive. Trade is a small part of the equation, but Adam Smith makes it seem like it's at the core of capitalism, and that it comes from who we are as humans. The reality is that capitalism is an economic system that has only properly existed for 500 years tops. The first people of our species, Homo sapiens, have been kicking it on Earth for several 100,000 years. Neoclassical economists like Smith would have you believe that we stumbled on capitalism, discovered it, as if it were a fact of human life that was out there untouched, but informing the development of our species. These economists, the first capitalist theorists, set out to do for economics what physicists had achieved around the same time: discover a natural property of the world. But this project is impossible, because we made capitalism up. It's the product of a specific historical context. On the one hand, you had the growing power of a merchant class butting up against the dying power of a monarchical class. Feudalism was toppled over the course of a few revolutions, and then exported around the world in a series of bloody conquests. And it happened not because we are built for capitalism, but because the feudal system just happened to set the stage for capitalism. Laws introduced the idea of private property, and technologies facilitating trade and production allowed people not born into nobility to acquire wealth. That's why we have capitalism today. Not because it's in our human nature, but because in a specific context it was the most efficient way to accumulate and then hold on to power. The idea that it was part of our human nature only came after. Our present hegemonic view of humans, as either a bloody, greedy, violent animal ready to descend into barbarity at the drop of a hat, or a rational, calculating, self-interested trader, came to dominate at precisely the same time as it became useful for giving legitimacy to the new political order. When capitalism emerged, it came with the myth that we are somehow incredibly rational in the context of a market, owing to our supposed predisposition to trade, but incredibly irrational and prone to violence in all other social matters. The natural solution seemed to fit with the existing society: an economy organized by a market coupled with a powerful state to keep the order, and the capitalist class at the head of the factory to keep us in line. So it stuck. It was endlessly reproduced as an incontrovertible truth, and, like the divine right of kings, became the myth that holds the justification for capitalism together. But it doesn't take much to see how contradictory this view of humanity is. It assumes that we are perfectly rational in economic affairs, geniuses at the grocery store able to make complex decisions and assess value on goods to find the perfect equilibrium between cost and return, but irrational idiots the second we have to make decisions about anything else, especially in the halls of government or academia. This is a useful contradiction for capitalist economists, because as soon as people act irrationally, meaning not like what their theories predict, economists can blame it on the fact that people are dumb when they aren't acting like the self-interest economic animal they expect humans to be, and their economic theories stay perfectly intact. Human nature is a safety valve for capitalist economics, a heuristic that can be used to model a society that just happens to benefit capitalists and simultaneously can find a justification when the model fails to explain reality. And at this point in the video, I want to bring us back to socialism. A lot of the misconception about the impact of human nature on socialism comes from the fact that socialism is often poorly defined. Socialism, when we talk about human nature, is often viewed as a society where everything is the same as it is right now, except that people share. That is not what socialism is. And it's easy to see how one greedy, selfish, or cruel person could completely ruin it if socialism depended on people being nice and the honor system. But in reality, socialism, at the economic level, isn't about sharing. It's a society where if everybody needs something, it's owned collectively, and we all get to decide how it's distributed. The means of production are held in common and subject to democratic control. Instead of individual business owners making decisions about production to serve their self-interest and submitting them to the market for review, and so be it if some people get none and others get almost everything, under socialism, the things that affect all of us are decided by all of us. This can take many forms. For example, banks could fund business projects on the basis of a democratic mandate, instead of venture capitalists and for-profit banks calling the shots. Businesses could be run by the people who work there, and who either elect their boss or make strategic decisions by vote, instead of your boss just being some random guy with money. Your town could hold meetings where people point out what's missing and devise ways to fill the gaps, instead of waiting around and hoping someone will find a way to solve the problem in a profitable way. Trade wouldn't disappear, but profit would. You can be as selfish as you want in this context, but good luck convincing everyone else to prioritize your needs at the expense of everyone else's. Without the power to withhold something from someone else because you're the sole owner, what you'll find is that these systems reward those who collaborate. This doesn't mean every little thing has to be approved by everyone else, or that you have to be nice. Everyone is free to be independent so long as that doesn't require taking independence from someone else in the process. All socialism means is that for decisions of societal importance, it's only right that a democratic process applies. Today, we live under a system that rewards those who screw others over. That's a legitimate winning strategy to get ahead under capitalism. In a socialist economy, the only difference is the winning strategy, not the people. None of this implies a perfect society where no one is ever upset, just a society where greed doesn't let a few lucky people take advantage of everyone else. At the end of the day, we'll always squabble about what human nature really looks like. But holding ourselves back by imagining we can't transcend our weaknesses isn't going to get us very far. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that this episode is made possible by Ren. We talk a lot about the failures of capitalism on this channel. One of the more obvious ones is our complete unwillingness to transition away from fossil fuel use, which has led us to the greatest crisis humans have ever faced, not to mention countless other species. So when Ren reached out to see if I'd be interested in working together, I was cautiously optimistic. As we all know, it's important not to individualize a systemic problem. Even if all of us as individuals take steps to reduce our emissions, we still have to contend with the power and greed of big business and the military-industrial complex, the main drivers behind the climate crisis. That being said, there are tangible ways each of us can contribute to the fight against climate change. One of those ways is through carbon offsets. Now, that comes with a big asterisk. There are plenty of shady groups out there that will take your money in exchange for vague promises to offset your carbon emissions, kind of like a modern form of indulgences. You feel better, but nothing really changes. It can be a challenge to find real, scientifically sound offset projects. Well, I'm happy to report that Ren is one of those projects that actually makes a difference. Ren is a website where you can calculate your carbon footprint, then offset it by funding a diverse mix of carbon reduction projects like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. When you sign up to make a monthly contribution to offset your carbon footprint, you receive monthly updates from the projects you support. You get to see what your money is spent on, with photos and details on every tree planted, every acre reforested, and every ton of carbon offset. One of the more interesting recent projects is the destruction of huge quantities of CFC refrigerants, which would otherwise leak into the atmosphere and accelerate climate change and continue to damage the planet's ozone layer. And this is just one of a number of promising projects aimed at helping tackle the climate crisis. The fight to rein in climate change and ensure a livable future will require more than just carbon offsets. But this is an easy, concrete way for each of us to make a tangible difference. So offset your carbon footprint with Ren. Be one of the first 100 people to sign up using the link below, and get your first month absolutely free. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.